What if I told you that in one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth, a machine the size of a small house crawled across the seafloor, vacuuming up ancient metal rocks? And for the first time ever, independent scientists were watching every single thing it did. This is the story of Mining Impact 2, and what they found in the Plume changes everything about the deep sea mining debate. So here's the situation. For decades, companies have wanted to mine the deep ocean. Specifically, they want manganese nodules. These potato-sized lumps of metal sitting on the abyssal plain, 4 to 5 kilometers below the surface. They're packed with manganese, nickel, cobalt, and copper, minerals the world desperately needs for batteries, wind turbines, and electronics. The biggest deposit of these nodules sits in a region of the Pacific called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, or the CCZ. It stretches across roughly 6 million square kilometers between Hawaii and Mexico, and it contains more nickel and cobalt than all known land reserves combined. Now, the International Seabed Authority, the ISA, has been handing out exploration contracts in the CCZ since the early 2000s. Multiple countries and companies hold license blocks out there, but here's the catch. Nobody had ever tested a full industrial scale collector system, while independent researchers measured exactly what happens to the ecosystem. Small experimental tracks, sure. Lab simulations, plenty, but an actual industrial prototype tearing across the real seafloor with scientists tracking the damage in real time. That had never been done. Until Mining Impact 2. Mining Impact 2 is a massive European research project coordinated by Geomar, the Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Kiel, Germany. It was funded under the JPI Oceans Framework, which pools marine research funding across European nations. And when I say massive, I mean it. 32 partner institutions from 10 different countries, with oceanographers, biologists, geochemists, and engineers, all working together across multiple research cruises. The whole point of this project was straightforward but ambitious. The Belgian contractor Demi GSR, one of the companies holding an exploration license in the CCZ, was going to deploy their pre-prototype nodule collector vehicle on the seafloor. And while DEME-GSR ran their collector across approximately 1/10 of a square kilometer of real nodule field, the Mining Impact 2 scientists would independently monitor every environmental consequence they could measure. We're talking sediment plumes, biological impacts, chemical changes in the water column, noise, all of it. This wasn't a company running its own environmental assessment. This was independent, publicly funded science watching over a contractor's shoulder. And that distinction matters enormously, because until this point, almost everything we knew about mining impacts came from either computer models or from the companies themselves. Mining Impact 2 changed that by producing the first independent scientific dataset from a realistic scale collector test. So let's talk about this collector vehicle. The machine DEME-GSR deployed is called a pre-prototype nodule collector, basically an early-stage industrial system designed to demonstrate how future commercial mining would actually work. Picture a tracked vehicle, a bit like an underwater bulldozer, crawling along the seafloor at the abyssal plain. It moves across the sediment, picks up the manganese nodules using a hydraulic collection system, and sends them up through a riser pipe toward a surface vessel. But here's the part that made scientists most nervous: the collection process. When you pick up nodules, you inevitably disturb the top layer of sediment they're sitting in. That soft, silty abyssal sediment hasn't been disturbed in some cases for millions of years. The moment the collector passes over it, a massive cloud of fine particles, the sediment plume, gets kicked up into the water column. Some of that sediment settles back relatively quickly, but the finest particles, they can travel for kilometers on deep ocean currents, potentially smothering organisms and altering habitats far beyond the actual mining track. The collector also creates what scientists call a blanketing effect directly on the track itself. Where the vehicle passes, it removes not just the nodules, but also the organisms living on them and in the top layer of sediment. Those organisms, tiny worms, crustaceans, sponges growing on the nodules, represent communities that took centuries or even millennia to establish. Now, the sediment plume was arguably the single biggest focus of Mining Impact 2, and for good reason. Before this test, models predicted plumes could spread anywhere from a few hundred meters to tens of kilometers depending on particle size and current conditions. But predictions are just predictions. What actually happened? The Mining Impact 2 team deployed an array of turbidity sensors, current meters, feeders and sediment traps around the test area. They used ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, to observe the plume in real time, and they collected water samples at various distances from the collector track. What they documented was a complex, multi-layered plume structure. Close to the collector, within a few hundred meters, the plume was dense and heavy with coarse particles that settled relatively fast. But the finer fraction, the stuff that's almost like dust suspended in water, drifted much farther, carried by bottom currents. And this is what scientists call the far-field plume, and it's the part that keeps marine biologists up at night, because the abyssal plain in the CCZ isn't empty. It's home to an extraordinary diversity of life, much of which we've only recently begun to catalog. Many species found in the CCZ are new to science. Some estimates suggest over 70% of the organisms collected from CCZ nodule fields have never been formally described. When a sediment plume rolls through and deposits even a thin layer of particles on top of these communities, it can smother filter feeders, clog respiratory structures, and bury the food sources that tiny organisms depend on. The Mining Impact 2 data showed that the plume's reach and settling behavior depended heavily on local conditions, current speed, particle composition, on a collector operation parameters. This variability is itself a critical finding because it means you can't just model one scenario and call it good. Every mining site, every season, every operational choice creates a different plume footprint. Beyond the plume, Mining Impact 2 scientists documented what happened directly on the seafloor where the collector had passed. And this is where the findings get sobering. Using ROV surveys, they compared freshly disturbed collector tracks with nearby untouched reference areas. The contrast was stark. In the tracks, the nodules were gone, the surface sediment was completely reworked, and the organisms that had been living there, the xenophyophores, the stalked sponges, the polychaete worms, were either destroyed or buried. Now, here's the key ecological question: can these communities recover? And the honest scientific answer from Mining Impact 2 is that we don't fully know yet, but the early evidence is not encouraging. Previous small-scale disturbance experiments in the CCZ, like the famous Discal experiment from the 1980s, showed that even decades after disturbance, the seafloor communities had not returned to their original state. The nodules themselves take millions of years to form. They grow at a rate of roughly 5 to 20 millimeters per million years. So once you remove them, you've eliminated a habitat structure that won't come back on any human timescale. Mining Impact 2 added to this picture by showing that even at the edges of the mining track, where physical disturbance was indirect, the combination of plume deposition and noise from the collector vehicle had measurable effects on the biological community. The impact zone was larger than just the strip the collector drove over. So this brings us to one of the biggest unresolved debates in the whole deep sea mining conversation. Can we design mitigation strategies that actually work? The ISA has designated 9 large areas in the CCZ as areas of particular environmental interest, APEIS. These are supposed to be no mining zones that preserve representative habitats and biodiversity. Think of them as marine reserves within the mining region, but Mining Impact 2 raised serious questions about whether these protected areas are sufficient. For one thing, the APEIs were designed based on relatively limited biological survey data. We're still discovering how species are distributed across the CCZ. And there's growing evidence that the biological communities inside license blocks may not be the same as those in the APEIs. If the protected areas don't actually contain the same species as the mined areas, then they're not truly protecting representative biodiversity. Buffer zones around individual mining operations are another proposed mitigation tool. The idea is that you leave unmined corridors between collection strips so that organisms can recolonize from adjacent intact habitat. But Mining Impact 2's plume data complicates this, because if fine sediment can drift kilometers from the source, a buffer zone of a few hundred meters may not be enough to keep adjacent areas truly unaffected. These are exactly the kinds of questions that Mining Impact 2 was designed to illuminate, not to give final yes or no answers, but to replace speculation with actual measurements. And that brings us to the policy stakes. The ISA has been working for years on a mining code, the regulatory framework that would govern commercial deep sea mining. Multiple nations, including Nauru and other Pacific Island states, have pushed for mining to begin, arguing that the minerals are needed for the clean energy transition. Meanwhile, countries like France, Germany, and Chile have called for a moratorium or precautionary pause, arguing we don't know enough about the consequences. Mining Impact 2 sits right at the center of this tension. Its findings findings are being cited by both sides. Proponents of mining point out that the test demonstrated a working collector system and that impacts, while real, were localized. Opponents emphasize the plume's far-reaching effects, the irreversibility of nodule removal, and the unknown biodiversity at stake. What both sides generally agree on is that Mining Impact 2 provided data we desperately needed, and that more independent monitoring at even larger scales is essential before any commercial operations begin. The Geomar-led consortium has made their scientific publications openly available, contributing to what might be the most transparent environmental assessment process in the history of seabed resource extraction. That transparency is itself a breakthrough in a field where data has historically been tightly held by contractors. Here's what I keep coming back to. The deep ocean is the largest habitat on Earth, and we're making decisions about its future right now with incomplete information. Mining Impact 2 didn't settle the deep sea mining debate. That wasn't its job. What it did was replace guesswork with science. It showed us what a sediment plume actually looks like at industrial scale. It documented the biological cost of removing nodules from the abyssal plain. And it proved that independent monitoring of contractor operations is not only possible, but absolutely essential. The next chapter of this story depends on whether the scientific community gets the funding and access to continue this kind of work, and whether policymakers listen to what the data actually says before the machines start rolling again. If you learned something from this video, subscribe. We go deep on science stories that most channels won't touch. Drop a comment and let me know, should we mine the deep ocean or leave it alone? I'll see you in the next one.